Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Today we are bringing you another one of our Drilling Deep series in which Adam Lowenstein talks to an author about a recent book that touches on climate or politics or democracy or some combination thereof. Today, Adam speaks with Wen Stephenson, the journalist and activist and author of the new book, Learning to Live in the Dark: Essays in a Time of Catastrophe. In it, Stephenson argues that the only way to confront the crises of our time is to meet despair head on, to see it for what it is, to feel it, and to accept what it means about where we are and where we need to go. Over the summer, Adam spoke with Stephenson about how he processes his own climate despair, what scholars of totalitarianism like Hannah Arendt and Albert Camus can teach us about fossil fascism, and whether a mass movement for climate action might not come together until enough people are desperate enough. This conversation is a lot like how Stephenson describes his book. It's about how to live into this era of climate and political and social catastrophe while holding on to our humanity. Just a note before we get into it that this conversation does briefly discuss suicide. If you are in crisis, please call or text or chat with the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 or contact the crisis text line by texting TALK, T-A-L-K, to 741-741. Here's Adam and Wen.
As a starting point, I wanted to ask you how you're feeling about having this book out in the world, because there's a lot of you and a lot of processing in the book that is now available for everyone to see and feel and read.
Yeah, I mean, it feels it's strange. I mean, I've written personal essays for a long time. And it's worth noting off the top, right, that like the vast majority of this book is not about me. There's some very personal stuff in it, of course, but that runs kind of as a thread through the essays, all the way to the end. But the vast majority of the book is not about me. But it's a risk, right? It's a risk one takes as a writer if you're going to get personal. And it's even a risk of a special kind as and I understand why the reasons why, just as a white straight cis male, writing on the within the left, to kind of be personal, because it's like, well, why should my story matter that much,
Yeah,
And I try to acknowledge that, obviously, off the top, like, what are my struggles compared to, the vast majority of people on the planet,
right.
and even in my own community for that matter.
Yeah, I wrestle with that idea of it almost feels indulgent sometimes.
Yeah,
I don't think it does to most people on the other side. Your book did not feel indulgent or self-indulgent to me, but it can feel that way from the writer's perspective.
right, exactly. And that's why we have editors, and that's why that's why, this was not a blog, right? I mean, I'm not just spewing this out there. This is very carefully considered, writing. But I do think it's important to bring the personal. It can be important, to bring the personal into books like this. I mean, maybe it's worth saying just like what kind of a book this is, and what kind it's not, and like why I wrote it. I mean, it's definitely a climate book, right? But I mean, that is the overarching and the unifying kind of, thread or theme, of the book. And I'm a climate writer and a climate activist and so on. But it's really not a typical climate book, at least I think the way that usually is, that is the term is used in the publishing world, because it's not a policy book and it's not a solutions book.
which I found very refreshing
Okay,
on a lot of
good.
levels. We'll probably get into that a little bit later in the
Yeah. We
conversation.
should. We should. There's lots to be said about that. But it is, as you've noted, it's a very personal book, and it's a very literary book, right? I mean, it's about much of it, most of it. These essays are about writers and thinkers, and yeah, there's a certain amount of political analysis and even polemic in the book, for sure. That's certainly part of it and part of who I am as a writer, and but more than that, I think it's what it is essentially is a kind of moral ethical inquiry into, as kind of the title implies, like how to live into this era of climate and political and social catastrophe that's upon us, while holding on to our humanity. I mean, that phrase, can become a cliche, of course, but I hope that in my book it's not, because I try to go very deeply into what that means under various scenarios, and what it has meant in the past, and what there is to learn, from writers and thinkers of the past. So on that kind of personal level, when I was in my really darkest moments in sort of 2016, 2017, like a lot of other people, and then again at various times over these last 8 years as I was writing this series of essays, I went looking, I kind of instinctively reached for a certain group of writers and thinkers of the mid 20th century, these kind of iconic, and I certainly wasn't the only person doing this in 2016, 2017, but these like iconic anti-fascist and anti-totalitarian thinkers and writers like Hannah Arendt and Albert Camus and Simone Weil and others, and I even ended up, looking very closely at the great anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon. That's where the book ends up. And I was looking for a sort of like the intellectual and moral and even spiritual sources of, or resources, sort of like for not, as I say, not hope, because I feel that term and that concept is kind of abstract and is means many different things to different people, but more like,
And we'll get into that a bit
yeah,
later.
we can get into that too. But more like, as I say, resolve. What I needed was resolve to just stay in the fight. And so, you know, I went looking for a reason to live and to keep fighting. And what I found in these writers and others, including contemporaries of ours, is really universal human solidarity. I mean, that's what I found, and or had reaffirmed for me.
Hmm.
And I mean, like across all our divisions of race and gender and class and ideology and religion, just probably the most important quote in the book, or one of them. There are a lot of quotes in this book, but maybe the most important, the one that means the most to me, I use as one of the epigraphs for the book. It's from Camus' novel, The Plague, which, if you or anyone else listening to this has not read Camus' The Plague, I highly recommend it. But it's where the main character, Dr. Roux, is talking to priest, Father Paralus. The doctor says to the priest at a very intense moment in their fight against the plague, "We're fighting for something that brings us together beyond blasphemies and prayers. It's all that matters." When I look at across our movements, on the left, and I think about my comrades and I think about members of my own family who are deeply conservative, for that matter. I'm looking for, what it is that could actually hold us together in the face of just now unimaginable, suffering and oppression and pain, and darkness.
That gets at something that weaves sometimes explicitly throughout the book, which is this idea of despair.
Yeah.
And I think to say that the book is just you processing a sense of despair, it is that, but it's a lot more than that.
Hmm.
And you go to great lengths to differentiate despair from nihilism, or on the other end of the feel-good spectrum, optimism and hope, as we talked about briefly before. Can you talk about what despair, how you think about despair in the context of the climate crisis?
Absolutely. You're right. I mean, this is central. I mean, this is the title of the book, right? How to learn, learning to live in the dark, which was the title. It's sort of the title essay of the book. My essay on Hannah Arendt in the time of Trump and climate was the first essay I really wrote in this series back in 2017. I was looking for someone who could help me, confront, really look into the abyss, right? And there are a few who did that kind of more productively than Hannah Arendt. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess the first thing that's important to say is that given what we're up against, right, that despair is warranted. That's really central for me. And that it's not, I say this kind of flippantly, but not really, because I say, it's not a sin, right? I mean, for Catholics, it's like one, I'm not Catholic, but I was raised in a conservative Christian family, but despair is not a sin, okay, as some would say. It's not like moral weakness or a flaw in your character. It's entirely understandable. In fact, it's rational on some level. But given those caveats, right, it is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
It can lead to some very dark places, almost by definition, right? It is those dark places, and so it's dangerous and it's defeating, especially politically. Like for anyone engaged in social and political movements, it's defeating. So it's something that needs to be worked through, preferably with others, like preferably in community, right, if possible. Or, like myself, with a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
as I did and still do, but I think I can honestly say that I've learned to live with despair, or, even the kind that has led me at times to question my own desire to live, like I've never really been truly like in a suicidal place. Like I've never attempted to end my life, but I've been close to that, I think. And it's worth also saying that, anyone listening to this, if that's where you are, or, have been there or are there now, please, like talk to someone, talk to your friends, talk to your closest friends or loved ones, someone you trust. If you need to talk to a therapist, please reach out. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 988. Yeah, I mean, I take this very seriously. I don't lightly write about this. I take it seriously as a response. My responsibility as a writer, broaching this topic in public. But really, we don't want to lose you. We don't want to lose anyone. We can't afford to lose you. You're needed and you're loved, and there is help if you reach out for it. So I just want to say that. But there's so much more to be said on this. But I guess the most important thing also is that about, the way I come at it in this book is I found that what's required for me to live with my despair, like I don't believe this despair is like an end point. There was a beautiful essay by Hanif Abdulkarim in the New Yorker recently about despair. I think it was called In Defense of Despair or something.
I think I saw the
Yeah,
essay you're
beautiful
talking about.
essay. I would highly recommend it. And it wasn't really at all about climate change or anything, but one of the main points he was making is that it doesn't have to be an end point,
Right.
something that you
It's not giving up.
right, it's not giving up. It's something that you can work through and learn to live with. Because I can say, even though I've learned to live with it, it's still there, right? It's still in me. So what I found I needed was not just some kind of quote unquote hope, which, I mean, what does that word even mean anymore in the context of climate? Like, we really have to, I mean, now I know a lot of people do use that term and have written about it beautifully. And so I think there are good answers to that. but I just needed something sturdier. Like I needed,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, resolve. Like for me, hope is abstract. It's resolve is visceral. It's like in your body. It's what you, yeah. So I had to actually kind of let go of hope. Any kind of abstract, cost-free hope, in order to find my resolve.
When it comes to thinking about despair, I think I've found that the honesty around it to be pretty refreshing, and feels like if we are to confront this crisis of our making, pretending it's not so bad is probably not a good place to start.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very well said. And I think that that's really partly what's been driving me for several years in writing about this. I want to give a shout out because I think there are other writers, certainly in the climate space, who have done this. I'm certainly not the only one. And shout out to Mary Heglar, who I know is a friend of Drilled and is someone who I think has done a wonderful job over the years of being of that emotional honesty, that kind of not just intellectual honesty, but emotional honesty about dealing with this stuff. And I think if there's something I can say that is, for lack of a better word, hopeful.
I am pro hope,
Yeah,
for the
okay.
record.
Yeah.
I think choosing hope is the only way forward.
Yeah, yeah.
And
For
I
me
think it can
too.
coexist with despair in a way that you managed to thread that needle in this book.
Yeah, and to not and just to be clear, like I know plenty of people who have found their way to a more complex and deeper meaning of hope than the kind of simplistic, version
Hmm.
that shallow version that gets thrown around so often. But and I deeply respect that. And you know what? Those folks and I are probably talking about the same exact thing. I've just found some other words for it. But if I could say something, yeah, like positive, it's that I think what I have found is that for me, the resolve is found in relationship to other people. It's found in other people. It's found in each other, right? Like the title of my first book was "What We're Fighting For Now Is Each Other," right? And so for me, the source of my resolve is that human solidarity. It's um, it's you, it's you, Adam. It's you and all the folks at Drilled and everybody listening to this podcast. It's like y'all are the source of my resolve at the end of the day. And I think that what I found over the course of a decade and a half working in social movements, mainly the climate justice movement, is that's what it is for most people. That's
Hmm.
what keeps us going, is each other and that sense of solidarity. That might sound somewhat pat or something, but but sometimes those simple things, simple statements are true.
I don't think it does sound pat, although like you, I understand how people could take it that way, in part for something for a reason you mention in the book, or at least that you touch on in the book, is words like solidarity are too often
Yeah,
thrown around. But the idea of solidarity, and I think you discuss it in the context of global solidarity,
right.
we like to talk about it, but it's the phrase in some ways has become almost meaningless.
Yeah. Oh, it is meaningless without the kind of action that's really required in order to
Hmm.
embody it and to, make it real. And I would also another shout out. I mean, I'd really send people to the writing of Astra Taylor and Leah Hunt Hendricks, and they had a recent
Hmm.
book on solidarity that is really a beautiful exploration of what it means and should mean and can mean for us right now.
What you mentioned there about the kind of authentic, real solidarity, the human connection, the person to person engagement, the thing that keeps you going, the thing that will probably keep the climate movement going, the thing that will keep humanity going, as it has thus far, is being with other people. That's definitely a theme in the book, and you talk whether it's Camus or Hannah Arendt or some of the others, there is this idea that they come back to a lot that you surface in your own book, which is, a real human being in front of you versus an abstraction of the concept of humanity. Describing people, let's say, as superfluous is sort of a key tenet of a totalitarian state, totalitarian way of seeing the world. Can you talk about that a little bit? Totalitarianism as a way of understanding the climate crisis. And I feel like we hear a lot about Hannah Arendt and other philosophers these days for good reason.
Yeah.
But we don't hear it in the context of climate as much necessarily.
Right. Yeah, I think this is a really central question. And what kind of dawned on me as I was reading The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt's great work that she first published in the early 50s and then updated in the later 60s. What is it that enables a system, a political system, to develop that essentially dehumanizes everyone who is under its domination? And there, of course, are historical, I mean, we can go back well before the mid 20th century and look at the system of chattel slavery or, and the global slave trade, or definitely colonialism, and which closely related, of course, and as I think it was Aimé Césaire who made the seminal argument that in some ways totalitarianism and fascism and in Europe in the 20th century was colonialism coming home to roost in Europe. But what struck me about that in relation to the climate crisis, I was trying to somehow come to grips with what kind of mindset enables someone and a political system to pursue relentless expansion of fossil fuels in the face of the science that we have. And as we all know, the leaders of the fossil fuel industry and the lobby and the politicians who are all part of that, they know full well what they're doing. They know full well what the climate science says. And
some of them knew before we did.
Exactly. Exxon has known for many decades. And what kind of a mindset allows you to just keep the pedal to the metal and accelerate into the abyss, to off of the cliff?
Yeah, they're not all sociopaths. There's a lot of them,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they're not all.
Right. And the answer is maybe just as simple as that. It doesn't require theorizing, the relationship between that and totalitarianism. Okay. In some ways, I am overthinking it, right? Um, but it helped me. It helped me because, Arendt's, analysis of the totalitarian mindset really helped me. And it had to do with the kind of this belief in the limitless nature of power. Okay. And a kind of pursuit of power and domination that requires, yes, turning, entire populations of humanity and, really everyone under its sway, um, treating them as superfluous, meaning, not at all useful or relevant to the ultimate end, which is, complete domination. And if you think about it, that is precisely what the fossil capital regime really is pursuing. It is a form of global domination. It is subjecting the entire human population to these catastrophic consequences and to the power, the sheer economic and political power of this industry and its political regime, right? I could probably do a better job of articulating all of this. Read the book.
Yeah.
Read that chapter. It's the first chapter of the book. So
It does pop up throughout the rest of the book, though.
yeah. I come back to it, of course, at the end, and maybe I don't know if you were planning to ask me about this, but
Yeah, let's go there.
yeah, the last chapter, which is a new essay, or it's the one long essay of the book that's original to the book, is about Fanon, Frantz Fanon, who, if folks aren't familiar, is the author of the great anti-colonial revolutionary manifesto, The Wretched of the Earth, right, which came out in 1961 or two. And he was deeply involved. He was a Martinican French black writer and psychiatrist who was educated in France and ended up getting deeply involved in the Algerian War of Independence, the Algerian Revolution that threw off French French colonial rule. I write about Fanon in the context of Gaza and the genocide that we're now seeing there. I was looking to that because, again, I have this sense that the climate justice struggle, will never really be as radical as it needs to be, as fearless and as serious as it needs to be until enough people are desperate enough to really lay everything on the line.
Which is where, spoiler alert, but
Yeah.
this is not a book that will be minimized by hearing. That is the essentially where you conclude the book.
Right, exactly, exactly. I'm reading Fanon in the context of both the Gaza genocide and the global climate catastrophe, which is also, as I argue, a kind of genocide, at least for large portions of the global population. And so I write there at the very end of that chapter, like, as in the history of anti-colonial liberation struggles, the climate justice struggle, the fight for a habitable planet and a livable human future in which justice is still possible, will not be radical enough or fearless enough until enough of us are desperate enough to risk everything. And then the question, maybe the only question left at this hour, is whether we will hold on to our humanity in our desperation. I look at Fanon because he is, in so many ways, and has been ever all through the beginning in the great great period of anti-colonial independence movements in the 60s. Once The Wretched of the Earth was published, he became this icon of the anti-colonial struggles, right? And this voice and this great prophet of. And that book famously opens up with this discussion of violence, of anti-colonial violence in particular. And he's been held up as this kind of apostle of unlimited violence against the colonizer. And as I started reading about Fanon and then really closely reading the book, it occurred to me that he, and others have seen this as well, I'm not just, is that he's actually not that. You know, he always affirmed the right to armed struggle, armed anti-colonial revolutionary struggle. But he was not a proponent of just unlimited violence, and especially against civilians. He was part of the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, the Algerian revolutionary movement, and its tactics of indiscriminate violence against French settlers and civilians, and against the French armed forces, was really influential, and including influential to the Palestinian liberation struggle. But one of the things that Fanon goes right on to say after that famous or infamous opening chapter is that an unlimited violence and an indiscriminate violence can actually destroy a movement, and can actually just from a purely strategic standpoint, can be counterproductive. And then he goes on by the end of the book as a psychiatrist who treated patients, in Algeria, both and in Tunisia, where he and other FLN leaders fled after the first couple of years of the war. He treated all sorts of patients. He treated, Algerian independence fighters and French civilians and French military and police who had been involved in torture and in all kinds of atrocities against the Algerian population and so on. And that final chapter of The Wretched of the Earth is incredibly powerful and eye-opening in just the way Fanon, somewhat subtly, because he wasn't going to just denounce the FLN's tactics, and I don't think that he ever would have, honestly. But he was complicating the whole thing. He was showing the costs, the very real, undeniable human costs of that kind of a war. And what's very clear is that he's focusing on the individual person, the costs at that individual personal level. And when you look at some of Fanon's other writings, famously Black Skin, White Masks, which was his first major book, which is still today um, valued for its insights into race and colonialism, he did adhere to a kind of universal humanism. That's what he wanted, you know. I mean, even someone like Edward Said, who you won't find a better anti-colonial theorist than Edward Said, pointed out about Fanon that he wanted a kind of humanism in which the colonized and the colonizer, or the European and the Algerian or whoever, were able to come together. That's pretty idealistic, right? I mean, uh, but it was really worth delving into. And so there's been talk about a climate movement that adopts a more Fanonian approach, right, as opposed to a Gandhian approach. Famously, in Andreas Malm, in his big blockbuster, if there was ever an unlikely bestseller, it was his book How to Blow Up a Pipeline.
Yeah, which you do discuss in an earlier chapter in this book
I
as well.
discuss in the book a little bit, and I interviewed Malm back in. I think I was the first American journalist to interview Malm about that book right before it came out, back in December 2020. He has this much quoted line about, we've had a Gandhian climate movement. Maybe there will come a time, when we'll need a Fanonian, climate movement. And I ask what that would really mean. And I think, like, oddly enough, it doesn't necessarily mean a violent climate movement. I mean, it probably means, and I personally have come around to the conclusion that yes, I accept the idea that some sort of violence, some sort of even armed struggle might one day be justifiable, might even now be justifiable in the case of, climate catastrophe and climate injustice. In some ways, because it is a form of colonialism, it is a form of totalitarian, domination.
And to say that climate change itself is not a violent undertaking, a
Right,
violent movement, would
right.
be to miss the obvious.
Right, but taking my cue there from Fanon, and what I learned about Fanon is that, like Fanon, will we be able to still hold on to our sense of humanity, our sense of universal humanity and humanism in that process, right?
Right.
That it does matter how we fight.
Right.
Matters not just strategically, but it matters on some deeper level. Yeah.
Toward the end of the book, I'm going to quote you here. You say that anyone involved in left politics should be asking themselves now just how far I'd be willing to go as an activist in the struggle against the fossil fuel industry and its political backers. And I'm wondering where you can take this in whichever direction you'd like, but where you come down on that personally, or how you would encourage folks on the left to think about that question.
Well, I mean, first off, I would say that it's going to be, it's something that each person has to answer for themselves, right? It's not something that I or anyone else has any right to prescribe for anybody else.
Right.
And that's one reason that these questions and this topic is always personal. But I think the reason we need to be asking ourselves that question is that I feel strongly that we're going to need, and we need right now and have needed for a while, a kind of movement that is willing to take big risks. And that requires individuals who are willing to take big risks, It doesn't mean by any means that everybody in the movement, everybody needs to be willing to take large, huge personal risks that are like our legal or physical risks, not saying that at all. But there is something to be said about a kind of risk aversion that has existed, in our politics and in the certainly the mainstream climate movement for a long time. You might just say it's an aversion to political risk or whatever, but and risks now, let's be clear, like the risk level has gone way up since the second inauguration of Donald Trump. And these are real, and these are not evenly distributed, right? Risk is not evenly distributed by any sense of the imagination, right? Any stretch. Someone like me, a white guy like me, my level of risk is considerably lower than a lot of other people who I've worked with over the years, and done actions with, and worked side by side with in the climate movement. And certainly right now, when you look at the kind of action that's being taken to protect communities in LA, for example, from mass deportations from ICE, and we're talking about people taking real risks. But the point is, when people are desperate, when people are oppressed, we can look to the history of movements by oppressed peoples for inspiration and for examples of movements that have been willing to take enormous risks, right? And I think that it's important to recognize that we're in that position now. Again, the risk isn't evenly distributed, but even someone like me or you is facing a level of threat and let's say it, oppression, that's something we've never faced before. Whether it's just climate change or whether it's the political situation, whether it's fascism. That said, I'm in favor of a kind of movement that is willing to break things, that is willing to, within reason and without trying to harm other people, is willing to go out and create a crisis, in some ways, create chaos for the fossil fuel industry, and force a kind of crisis on them that they've never had to really face before. And it entails all sorts of risks. I talked about this with Andreas Malm. It's like, of course, everything from political blowback to security state repression, our increasing fascist police state that we're facing. But we got to ask ourselves, at what point, does this become unavoidable, right? At what point does it become unavoidable? I've worked in spaces and I've worked on direct action campaigns where these kind of risks were taken very seriously. I haven't ever sabotaged anything, but okay. Something else to say on that is that I think it's really important. I say this in that same chapter you were just quoting from. Really important to acknowledge that going out and committing some kind of quote unquote revolutionary act, right? Like blowing up a pipeline or whatever. Um, that in itself does not make a revolutionary movement or a revolutionary politics. So-called revolutionary tactics do not make a revolutionary politics all by themselves. Only movements can do that, right? So, for me personally, in order for that kind of radical action to really make sense, it would have to be, first of all, very carefully considered as strategic. It would have to be sustained, not just one-offs, right? And it would need to have the support, the backing now, obviously, that backing may not be public, it may not be explicit, overt, but it would have the backing of a movement, right? Of a large movement. And those conditions do not currently exist. So I don't think it would necessarily make any sense to go out and sabotage a pipeline or whatever at this moment, because I don't think it might be just a waste of effort and a waste of a life, being sent to prison. But then again, if we're collectively working toward that kind of a, explicitly that kind of a strategy, that kind of a goal, I think those conditions certainly could exist, and maybe sooner rather than later. I think there are a lot of people in this country and internationally who are getting to this point. But I think those caveats are really important.
The fact that that movement does not exist right now gets at something that you talk about in the book, which is, and I'm curious if I'm framing this in the way that you'd say is accurate, the climate movement more broadly, which has never been one monolithic entity.
Right. Yes.
But it does come in for some criticism, I think deservedly so, in the book, as I think you're arguing not appreciating the extent to which more radical and revolutionary thinking is probably required if we're to make any sort of substantive political change. Is that a fair way to summarize it?
Yes. Yes. It's not to say that there isn't a role for the mainstream. That's not to say that at all.
Right.
I'd be crazy if I thought that the entire movement was going to become as radical as I'm talking about. But it's something well known in social movement theorizing and study history, which is the radical flank. Now, the climate movement has had a radical flank for a long time, ever since certainly even before I got into it, back in like 2011 or so. And I reported on and wrote about a lot of some of the people who were very much part of that radical flank back in the earlier years of the movement and sort of around the Keystone fight and so on. There's the radical flank effect, has been seen many times in history, and it opens up space, political space for the more, mainstream part of the movement, the sort of political inside game to work. It can also kind of shake things up and break up a situation that's become kind of ossified, right? So it can create new dynamics that didn't exist before. This might be a good place in the conversation for me to. I first wrote it back in 2019 at kind of the peak of, or almost the peak of Green New Deal advocacy and the building of the Green New Deal coalition, which, by the way, as critical as I may be at times, that was the most hopeful thing that I'd ever seen, and I still think, we need to be looking back to that period of like 2018 to 2020 when the Green New Deal coalition was coming together.
We probably don't have time to get into this, but I would say it's not conspiratorial to say that the explosion of quote-unquote moderate center and corporate climate commitments in 2018, 2019, 2020 was certainly not unrelated to the immense popularity of the Green New Deal,
yes,
which was far more threatening to them than posting a green PDF on their website.
Yes, and I'll go further and I'll say, look, we had the Green New Deal concept and policies even were central to Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign. Definitely moved Biden well to the left on climate. Build Back Better wouldn't have existed without the Sanders campaign and the Green New Deal being at the center of that, right? That's why we had people like Varshini Prakash of the Sunrise Movement and sitting, being as part of the Sanders team that sat down with the Biden team and hashed out what became Build Back Better, right? Now, of course, that was all eviscerated and became the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as useful as it has been for spurring, clean energy development in this country, obviously was not anything like a Green New Deal.
Right. Right.
Even though, of course, it's labeled that by everyone on the right, but that's a whole nother topic, right?
Right. Yeah, I've distracted us there.
And the fact that it's now being completely dismantled, and yeah. But I think this would be a good place for me to inject this idea, which is that when we talk about the climate movement, the climate justice movement, or what we often call nowadays the climate left, that's a term that I think also was kind of born out of the Green New Deal coalition, which was bringing labor in and was bringing a lot of people who hadn't traditionally been part of the climate movement into the conversation, into the organizing, right? So when we think about the climate justice movement or the climate left and its relationship to the broader left, okay, I think is crucial. I've felt for quite a while now that the time for a mere climate movement or even climate justice movement has passed. That I think it had passed even by 2019, okay? And what I mean by that is it's clear that a climate movement or what we call nowadays the climate left is never going to build enough just sheer political power on its own to literally overthrow the fossil capital regime, right? And I think of something that Olufemi Taiwo wrote last year in a really good piece in Boston Review. He made it so explicit where he said something like, the strategic imperative is that the strategy has to be the complete defeat, the utter defeat of the combined interests of oil, gas, and coal producers, right? In order for any of our climate justice goals to be even a remote possibility. I think it's pretty clear that no individual kind of siloed social movement on the left is going to build the kind of power required to do that. So, what we need, and I think what we've always needed, is not so much a climate movement or a climate left as an actual left. Like a resurgent, revolutionary left, and revolutionary can mean all sorts of things, right? But I'm mainly talking here about political revolution, you know, maybe something a little more sweeping and transformational than Bernie was talking about in 2016 and 2020, where he popularized the phrase political revolution, right? But what we're talking about is a left, a movement of movements, a popular front, if you want to call it that, that has both climate survival, okay, so meaning deep decarbonization, and economic and social justice, right, at its core, right? And that was the idea of the Green, and is the idea of the Green New Deal coalition, right? But it needs to be expressly uh, revolutionary or transformative in its goals, its political goals. And that isn't going to happen with any one individual movement on the left. It will take the entire left and then some. Coalition building will mean including the center left in that. That's not something that's really on the table right now, which which is another reason for, despair, right? Because we needed this yesterday. We needed this 10 years ago. But, I think that there's a lot of self-blame, self-recrimination in a way in the climate movement. A lot of, this feeling that we have failed. But I'm not really sure why we've put that entire like world-saving burden on ourselves as climate activists,
Hmm.
It's not like climate activists can do this on our own, right? It's not just the climate
To
movement,
overthrow the most powerful industry in the history of humanity.
right? It's not like the climate movement itself alone has failed. It's like the entire progressive left has failed, okay? Like the left should have prioritized climate and climate justice decades ago, right? And there are all sorts of reasons why it didn't, and some of that is the blame of climate activists and the environmental movement for sure, right? But at some point, you got to ask yourself, like, why wasn't there something like a Green New Deal coalition bringing labor and racial and social justice into the, one big movement? Why wasn't there that 20 years ago? Because it was clear 20
Yeah.
years ago what we were facing.
I found it righteous and clarifying the way you phrase it in that 2019 essay about the Green New Deal. I think everyone from essentially the center right on leftward at this point would not consider themselves, ourselves, as climate deniers. But you describe in that essay, as you put it, anything less than revolutionary political change is essentially a new type of climate denial. Maybe this gets back to what we were talking about a little bit before, where despair is a reflection of being honest. It seems like, again, not just the climate movement, but the center and the left more broadly, we have engaged in what in hindsight seems like at least a decade of this new climate denial, of thinking, reassuring ourselves that piecemeal, incremental, market-driven, technocratic tweaks to the way things are can solve this problem, whatever solve means
Right.
at this
Whatever
point.
solved.
But yeah, can you talk about what that, I guess, why you think of this as a new form of climate denial?
I mean, I don't mean to say that it's obviously, as you were getting at there, it's not denial of climate science, although it's denial of what climate science tells us is really necessary at the political and economic level, right? I mean, the climate scientists have been quite clear. I mean, the IPCC itself came right out and said in 2018 that, on its famous report on 1.5 degrees C and the difference between that and 2C and what would be required to actually achieve 1C,
Yeah.
1.5 C, which is now pretty much the game. That game is up. I mean, we're already passing it. But they've made it very clear that it was going to require unprecedented transformative change at the political and economic level. So what I'm talking about, though, is a kind of political denialism,
Hmm.
or maybe call it just wishful thinking. Okay, might be kinder way to put it. It's inconceivable that our current two-party system, our current the Democratic Party that we have today as the only opposition to MAGA and the right and the full control of the fossil fuel industry over our politics at this point.
Yeah. Speaking of reasons for despair,
Yeah, it's inconceivable
the Democratic Party taking on Trump and MAGA.
exactly. It's inconceivable that the current iteration of the Democratic Party, is capable of what we're talking about. And so clearly, there has to be, at the very least, a kind of political revolution within the Democratic Party. But more likely, in order for that to even be a possibility, there has to be a broad, bottom-up, mass uprising of some sort, a kind of, truly mass movement that can force the issue and that can really bring things to a halt, right? And so there has been talk. I mean,
Hmm.
one of the most positive developments, I think, in recent years has been, maybe longer than just recent years, has been the call from the UAW and Sean Fain for kind of synchronous strikes, right, in 2028, and basically a general strike. The
Right.
idea of a general strike. I mean, that's the level of political uprising that we're talking about. That's the kind of mass movement that we're talking about, right? It's got to be at that scale and that level. And that isn't happening right away. And it can't really happen. It can't just, you don't just snap your fingers and a guy like me doesn't just write an op-ed piece saying we need a political revolution and
If
expect
only, yeah.
something to just organically materialize, right? It's like, as Jane McAlevey, the great labor writer, late great labor writer and organizer, always said, right? There are no shortcuts. And she was referring specifically to, within labor organizing, but I think it's true broadly of left, mass movement organizing. There's not really a shortcut to this. Now, on the other hand, we are not starting from scratch, right? There's been a lot of movement building over the last decade, and I think we can continue to build on that, where we need to be. And there are some real positive developments in that area, along those lines.
As we're talking and as I was reading the book, and in general, as I'm following the trajectory of humanity and the climate, I come back to what you write about in the very last part of the book that you were quoting earlier about.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't say this with a sense of fatalism, although it might come off that way. It does feel like there will come a point when, again, paraphrasing you here, that enough of us are desperate enough that there will be the conditions for such a movement to come together.
Yes. And I don't think that it'll just be climate that will cause that desperation. That was also kind of what I'm getting at there, right? I wrote that in that piece in 2019. I was like, the only thing worse than climate catastrophe is climate catastrophe plus fascism,
Right.
which I hate to say is kind of where we are, right? And that's been an idea that has circulated for a long time, right? We've known for decades, and people have warned that, climate change itself could very easily give rise to the kind of social situation, social breakdown that could lead to fascism. And then, of course, we've had forms, certainly fascistic forms of control and governance, in this country and elsewhere for a long time. But I don't think what you said there is fatalistic in the least. I don't see it that way because the whole premise, right, is to fight. No one in my book is talking about folding up their tent and going home, right? I mean, we're right, but it's being honest and facing up to the conditions that we have and that we are facing and that what we are going to be living into in the coming decades. And so those are the conditions under which we're going to have to practice politics, in which we're going to have to build movements and that we're going to have to fight. And in some ways, that's going to make our task far more difficult. And, maybe in some ways it might actually open up opportunities.
When we accept or come to terms with the fact that the old rules don't really apply anymore, that does, I think there's a sense of freedom that can follow that.
Right, exactly.
In writing these essays and reviewing them for this book, did you personally get where you wanted to get or where you needed to get, whether that's a sense of clarity or, I guess, peace of some kind? Did you get where you needed to get with this book, do you think?
Personally, yeah. I mean, man, that's a tough question because, you know, some days I feel that way and other days I don't.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on when you catch me.
Right.
But
Yeah. How about right now?
yeah, I mean, I would say that right now I feel about as mentally healthy as I probably ever get. Which isn't to say that I'm entirely mentally healthy. The despair is always there. It's like I use this phrase in the book. I'm on the other side of despair. I've worked through it, and that doesn't mean it's just gone away and everything is great, everything's fine. But I'm learning to live with it. And again, I can't stress this enough. The healthiest things I do, the healthiest things in my life are being part of communities, being part of communities of people who are actually working together on this. Being in isolation, being a self-sufficient individual, is not the way.
It was interesting going back to what we were talking about, focusing on the dignity of the individual human being versus the abstraction, the idea of humanity, and thinking about that alongside this idea that none of us can do this alone. There's a way of seeing people as individuals while also recognizing that the sort of neoliberal individualistic approach to surviving in the 21st century is doomed to fail.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting to the way you talk about them. I'm getting all sorts of balloons now, thanks to Zoom. Zoom really liked my point. But the way that you talk about the individual and the way that these philosophers and thinkers who you cite talked about the individual, it's almost like reclaiming the individual, the idea, the value, the dignity in the individual from the way it's been warped by the right, by the neoliberal, capitalist.
And to some extent by the left as well. Although what I'll say there is I am not a member of the anti-woke liberal consensus, that's not me at all. But I do think what I was trying to break down here is this kind of simplistic binary that kind of opposes collectivism and identity politics, group-based politics with individualism. Like, I think that it's never that simple. And most of the people I know and have been in deep conversation with in the climate justice movement and, people of all identities. One thing that we seem to agree on is that's far too simplistic.
Mm-hmm.
And that a healthy community and a healthy movement values every individual, right? At the same time that we recognize difference and that we especially recognize differences of privilege and of social oppression, right? So all that said, I guess what I'm trying to do, or what I realized at some point, is that I'm just not willing to give up, a sense of universal humanism, a sense of universal human solidarity, right? Like, and I think it's important that, I'm looking back to these writers who are part of the liberal humanist tradition. I mean, look, Hannah Arendt and Albert Camus are not necessarily authors, thinkers that you'd expect to find in a book published by Haymarket. Okay, I mean, Haymarket Books, a self-described radical left publisher, right? I mean, these folks are liberal humanists, and they have a lot to answer for. I mean, that tradition has a lot to answer for, right? But I'm not willing to throw out the humanist baby with the liberal bathwater, you know? It's like, um, I'm not a liberal anymore. I'm way too far left to be considered a liberal, right? Right? But I do consider myself a universal humanist, and I think it is possible. There is such thing as a radical left humanism.
There's a question you ask in the book, and I wanted to pose it to you and see if you have come to an answer or some semblance of an answer through this process.
Okay.
And you ask, what does a life of radical commitment look like?
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you have an answer that, I guess, that satisfies you for now.
Yeah.
Because there's no way to answer it clearly and unequivocally.
Right. And I first of all, again, right off the top, I would say I wouldn't try to prescribe for anyone. I'm not going to tell you, Adam, like what a life of radical commitment must look like for you. All right.
Although I wouldn't mind some guidance. It would make the figuring out of life
Yeah.
a little simpler.
Right. Well, there are kind of two operative terms in that question: radical and commitment. The kind of radicalism I'm talking about there is the kind that both has a radical analysis, right? It's on that intellectual level that sees the problem, in a radical sense of seeing, going to the root of the problem, which for me and many others increasingly is our capitalist system, and is our system of, our the legacy of colonialism and slavery and all of that, which are totally capitalism, and those are totally intertwined. But it also refers to a kind of radicalism. I don't want to say merely of tactics, right? Like the willingness to go sabotage a pipeline or something, but kind of on a personal level, that willingness to do the things that others will find extreme, to do and say the things that will be called extreme, called unreasonable, well outside the Overton window, of polite discourse, polite and reasonable discourse. And so I think, what does that look like? Well, we can look at all sorts of examples from history, right? I mean, the abolitionists were the radicals of their time and were considered dangerous and extreme, and pretty much every successful social movement in American history alone, you can look back, and the people who led those movements were the radicals of their time, and they were considered extreme. And they had that radical analysis too, right? That's what was driving those movements. So yeah, like for me, the word commitment then is, let's say I reach a point where I get it. I've kind of reached that point intellectually and internally, in terms of my resolve to, take action or say the things that need to be said. The commitment part, I think, has to do with the long haul, staying in it, sticking with it for the long haul. That really is what the book is all about, right? Where does that kind of commitment come from? I don't know. I just don't know. The best answer I have is that it comes from my comrades, right? It comes from that collective sense of solidarity, right? But that's in some ways too easy an answer. I think just each one of us, it's spiritual, for lack of a better word. Doesn't mean it's religious in any like conventional sense, but for some people it is. For me, it actually is. But it somehow it requires a willingness, an introspection and a level of self inquiry into parts of ourselves that we don't really understand.
I think that's a good place to end it. I will just say that even though it is a heavy book, a heavy topic, it did, as I was reading it and then having this conversation with you just now, it makes me feel like we're going to find our way through it. Don't know how, but there's something about confronting the darkness or the despair head on in solidarity with other people that makes it feel doable. Not without struggle and strife
Right.
and hardship, but certainly doable. So I am very grateful for you for writing the book and for this conversation. So thanks very much, Wen. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. And amen, brother.